Alors bonjour tout le monde, c'est un plaisir de vous avoir aujourd'hui pour la seconde session des MEDays, une session particulière, MEDays Talks, qui est ici pour souligner que en fait les discussions autour des thématiques que MEDays a commencé dès 2008 ne s'arrêtent pas, quelles que soient les circonstances, tout comme ce qu'a fait l'humanité pendant cette crise qui est sans précédent du Covid-19. Alors, avant de commencer cette session, je tenais particulièrement à rendre hommage à la mémoire d'un participant très prestigieux qui nous a quittés ce matin, M. Saïb Erkat, le secrétaire général de l'OLP, qui était avec nous lors des derniers débats, lors de plusieurs derniers débats, et qui ne manquait pas de défendre les intérêts de son peuple et de son organisation et de sa future nation, ou de sa nation. Et c'est la dernière victime d'aujourd'hui du Covid-19 qui a emporté 1,3 million de personnes déjà, 50 millions de contaminations. Donc vous imaginez l'impact que cela a eu sur nos sociétés et économiquement l'impact que ça va avoir pendant les mois à venir. Nous avons quelques signes encourageants, mais la route sera encore longue et ça sera l'occasion dans ce débat justement de pouvoir évoquer toutes les pistes qui seront exploitées et qui seront bien entendu à long terme, qui feront partie intégrante de nos sociétés ayant subi justement, on sera presque inoculé du virus du Covid, et avec ces nouvelles technologies, on va voir comment la société finalement va évoluer, va avoir ce bond qualitatif. Alors nous avons avec nous aujourd'hui un panel assez exceptionnel. Nous avons deux anciens chefs de gouvernement, Monsieur Yves Le Terme, pardonnez-moi, Yves Le Terme, qui était Premier ministre de Belgique à deux reprises, ministre des Affaires étrangères, qui était secrétaire adjoint de l'OSCE, et secrétaire général de l'Organisation intergouvernementale pour la promotion de la démocratie et de l'assistance électorale. Et sans perdre trop de temps et pour vous laisser un suspense sur quelles sont les autres personnalités que nous avons dans le panel, je vais les présenter au fur et à mesure. Je vous laisse la parole, Monsieur Yves Le Terme. Surtout, si vous pouvez nous parler non seulement de l'impact du Covid dans votre pays, bien entendu, mais également sur les process électoraux, parce qu'on a eu des surprises de participation sans précédent durant, par exemple, l'élection très récente américaine. Je vous laisse la parole,
Merci
monsieur.
beaucoup. Merci beaucoup. Bon après-midi. Donc, j'ai compris qu'on parle en français. Je ne sais pas si le français, c'est la langue à utiliser, mais bon, je vais donc parler en français. Merci beaucoup de m'accueillir au MEDays et aussi félicitations et beaucoup d'appréciation pour les responsables de MEDays qui, par ce système à distance et par voie électronique, réussissent à maintenir la tradition de cette organisation quand même très, très appréciée par le monde et de nous offrir aussi la plateforme pour échanger. Je vais être bref, je voudrais dire quelque chose sur les trois sujets que vous avez cités. Donc, premièrement, la crise Covid en soi. Deuxièmement, le post-Covid. Et comme vous l'avez demandé, je suis prêt à donner quelques commentaires sur ce qui s'est passé aux États-Unis. Commençons sur le Covid-19. Je crois que depuis hier, avant-hier, de par le monde, il y a un changement très fondamental dans l'évaluation de la situation. Je crois que la nouvelle qui a été délivrée par la firme Pfizer, même pour les non-spécialistes, était quelque chose d'extrêmement important et qui donne beaucoup d'espoir. Naturellement, on reste à voir maintenant qu'est-ce que ça signifie précisément en termes de disponibilité du vaccin, quelle sera la possibilité de répandre ce vaccin, de le mettre à disposition de la population. Population quand même d'à peu près 7 milliards de citoyens dans le monde. Donc pour amener un vaccin qui finalise avec succès les périodes de testing qui sont encore à accomplir. De ce point-là, arriver à un accès généralisé pour toute la population mondiale commençons avec les groupes les plus délicats, les groupes prioritaires. Il reste, je peux imaginer, tout un effort logistique et tout un timeline qui doit être assez impressionnant. Mais en tout cas, je crois que ce qui est sorti hier de chez Pfizer donne une bulle d'espoir et je crois qu'on en avait beaucoup besoin. Donc, ça donne du courage. Espérons, et vous savez que l'Europe est très touchée, la Belgique, la France sont parmi les pays les plus touchés en ce moment. Je crois que depuis hier, on sent dans les conversations, on sent dans les médias, mais aussi dans les conversations parmi les citoyens, quand même un regain un peu d'optimisme. Le tout, je crois maintenant, je ne suis pas médecin, je ne suis pas spécialiste du tout, le tout c'est comme ça a été dit déjà aujourd'hui, c'est de bien gérer maintenant la situation. Si ce vaccin arrive, a le potentiel qui a été suggéré, il faudra rendre l'accès le plus vite possible. L'accès non seulement dans les pays les plus développés, mais aussi dans les pays les plus pauvres. Et donc, je crois que là, pour les organisations intergouvernementales, pour les gouvernements, il y a tout un travail à faire et je crois que ça doit vraiment être la priorité numéro 1. Et j'espère qu'à même au niveau du G20, non seulement aux organisations régionales, mais qu'au niveau du G20 aussi, qu'on se saisisse de cette opportunité. Il pourrait y avoir un peu plus de clarté maintenant sur la disponibilité d'un vaccin. Essayons maintenant, en tant qu'autorité publique au niveau mondial, de mettre en place tout ce qui est nécessaire comme infrastructure, comme effort collectif pour rendre l'accès de ce vaccin durant je présume, les 1, 2, 3 ans qui sont devant nous, que ça se passe le mieux possible. En ce qui concerne la phase post-Covid, je crois que 2 éléments au moins sont cruciaux pour évaluer la situation économique post-Covid et les chances qu'on a d'assister à un renforcement de l'économie et de reprendre un peu une voie de croissance. Les 2 concepts cruciaux pour moi, c'est le regain de confiance, la confiance qui va revenir, confiance des consommateurs, confiance des investisseurs et confiance de tous les opérateurs économiques. Et là, je crois qu'on doit être très lucide. Déjà avant le phénomène Covid, déjà avant février-mars cette année, il y avait des problèmes sous-jacents à l'économie mondiale. Par exemple, le fait que l'OMC était en crise, qu'il n'y avait pas de grande percée au niveau du commerce mondial, était certainement une raison pour lesquelles les investisseurs, les consommateurs, mais surtout les investisseurs avaient des doutes, étaient gagnés par un certain scepticisme. Et il est clair que ça opérait une pression downward pressure sur la potentialité de croissance. Donc, crucial sera à quel rythme et de quelle façon on peut réinstaurer une confiance des opérateurs économiques, les foyers, les consommateurs, mais aussi les investisseurs. Ça, je crois que c'est crucial. Et beaucoup va dépendre aussi, je crois, de l'environnement au niveau du commerce mondial. Et là, je crois qu'à l'administration Biden, il serait très utile que cette administration puisse assez vite donner des signaux clairs et sans équivoque sur leur volonté de réintégrer le système WTO, de réintégrer le système OMC et d'avoir des signaux positifs concernant, je dirais, la promotion du libre-échange et la promotion du commerce mondial. Le commerce mondial a été, il ne faut pas l'oublier, durant les 15, 20, 25 dernières années, l'ascenseur vers le développement économique, l'ascenseur pour les pays moins développés, je dirais un moyen pour l'essor des pays moins développés pour accéder à plus de pouvoir d'achat et accéder à plus d'activités économiques. Donc, confiance et confiance relatée à les projets concernant l'évolution du commerce mondial. Deuxième concept, et ça c'est un peu plus délicat, un peu plus difficile, et c'est un peu moins du ressort des autorités publiques. Je crois que pour avoir à nouveau un démarrage de l'économie au niveau mondial et dans toutes les parties du monde, à côté de la réinstallation d'un niveau de confiance, du regain de confiance, il est très important de voir si on assistera à un regain de productivité, à des gains de productivité. Je crois que les grandes crises systémiques précédentes que nous avons connues elles ont eu, à la fin, il y a eu des percées, des breakthroughs, des percées de nouvelles technologies, de nouveaux produits de consommation, que ce soit l'automobile, que ce soit les chemins de fer, que ce soit les ordinateurs. Donc, on a reboosté l'économie mondiale par la confiance, mais aussi par des gains de productivité. Et donc, je crois qu'il est crucial pour l'avenir économique, il sera crucial pour voir, observer s'il y a vraiment des pas en avant qui sont faits au niveau de la productivité. Les spécialistes nous disent qu'on a été forcé à être plus productif et à éliminer toutes sortes de coûts avec le télétravail, avec l'utilisation massive de moyens de télécommunication, que c'est un aspect bénéfique de la crise que nous vivons, qui a été terrible au niveau des niveaux de consommation, au niveau de la confiance, etc., mais qui a cet aspect bénéfique que ça donnait un push à l'automatisation, à l'efficacité et à, je dirais, du cost-cutting intelligent. Donc, je crois que ces deux éléments vont être cruciaux, réinstaurer une certaine confiance des opérateurs économiques et si on arrive vraiment à avoir une poussée de gains de productivité. Deux petits footnotes sur deux, je dirais, question marks, deux points d'interrogation en ce qui me concerne, c'est l'évolution de la dette. Nos économies sont bourrées de dettes et on a essayé de résoudre la crise de la dette il y a 10 ans environ en créant plus de dettes. Je ne vais pas entrer dans les détails, mais donc, qu'est-ce qu'il advient de cette masse de dettes dans les pays développés, les pays moins développés et autres? Et deuxième question mark, c'est quelle sera la qualité du rebond de l'économie chinoise? Là, je crois qu'on a des raisons pour avoir un certain optimisme. Il ne faut pas oublier que durant les 10-15 dernières années, je crois que tant au niveau du développement économique que du développement humain en soi, c'est la Chine qui a livré le plus grand effort, enfin pas le plus grand effort, mais qui a amené le plus de progrès. L'explosion du pouvoir d'achat, l'explosion du nombre de gens qui sont en mesure de dépenser de l'argent au sein de la population chinoise, c'est une évolution, ça a été très, très remarquable, mais il faut voir si ça redémarre vraiment, comme les premières données semblent le dire. Troisième et dernier cluster, c'est les élections américaines. Bon, il est clair qu'en effet, j'ai observé ça avec beaucoup d'intérêt. Il y a des éléments positifs au niveau de la participation. Je crois que le voter turnout est historiquement important. Toujours est-il que la démocratie américaine souffre encore toujours de maux qu'on connaît déjà depuis quelques décennies. La complexité, le fait qu'il y a 50 législations différentes, que chaque État a sa loi électorale, mais aussi par exemple le rôle que l'argent joue dans la démocratie américaine. Il n'y a pas vraiment de limite efficace à la dépense d'argent et ce problème qui est déjà là depuis beaucoup de décennies devient plus grave lorsque l'argent est couplé à ce qu'on appelle les fake news, je dirais, une certaine manière de faire de la politique. Il y a toujours, partant de candidats politiques, il y a toujours, je dirais, une relation un peu équivoque avec la vérité, avec les faits. Les campagnes électorales amènent toujours des exagérations, amènent toujours des candidats, des politiciens à mettre les choses un peu pas toujours très réaliste, mais quand même au cœur du débat démocratique américain, il y a ce rôle joué par l'argent dans l'agenda setting, dans la mise en avant de thématiques et dans la façon dont le débat et la campagne électorale se jouent. Je crois que ce rôle de l'argent est trop grand. Phénomène naturellement spectaculaire cette fois-ci, j'en conclus par là, c'est les votes par correspondance, donc les dizaines de millions de gens qui ont voté cette fois-ci par correspondance. C'est quelque chose de jamais vu, naturellement lié à la crise Covid. Ça a joué un rôle dans la perception aussi à l'avant de ce qui allait se passer au niveau électoral, de la prédictabilité du résultat électoral. Pour conclure, je dirais que la crise qu'on connaît pour l'instant, ou qui pourrait, crise c'est peut-être un mot trop grave, mais ce qui se passe aux États-Unis, c'est peut-être plus dû à la personnalité du président sortant et à, je dirais, ce qu'on va voir en ce qui concerne les relations entre le pouvoir législatif, le pouvoir exécutif, le pouvoir judiciaire, mais qu'il y a sous-jacent qu'il reste ces problèmes de la complexité du système, les 50 législations différentes, du rôle de l'argent, du fake news qui joue un rôle croissant et naturellement aussi dans la détermination des résultats, le rôle qui a été joué cette fois-ci par les votes par correspondance. Dernière phrase, et j'en termine par là, je crois honnêtement que le pays le plus puissant économiquement du monde mérite un reset de ses méthodes électorales, une amélioration de son système électoral. Les Américains méritent mieux en ce qui concerne leur système électoral, mais ça nous mènerait trop loin, je crois, pour entrer dans les détails en ce qui concerne cela. S'il vous plaît.
Oui, merci beaucoup, Excellence, Monsieur Yves Le Terme, pour votre intervention. On va essayer de rendre la session un peu plus interactive. Les questions du reset américain, je pense que, bien entendu, nous allons avoir Monsieur Ulman Harlan qui va parler du reset et de ce que, stratégiquement parlant, une crise aussi grande que le Covid peut faire sur la plus grande puissance militaire et aussi économique d'une certaine mesure mondiale et sur les systèmes démocratiques en général. On a vu comment la Chine finalement était beaucoup plus résiliente par rapport à la crise du Covid et c'était lié essentiellement à son système de gouvernance. On a maintenant une confrontation entre deux modèles. Et puis, sans rentrer dans les détails que l'on va évoquer dans l'ère post-Covid, un peu plus tard dans la discussion, je souhaiterais présenter son Excellence Laurent Lamotte, Premier ministre du Haïti, juste après le tremblement de terre de 2011. Et je vais lui demander de nous présenter justement ce que c'est que de gouverner dans une situation extrême, et bien entendu, comment finalement les pays en développement ont pu gérer cette crise du Covid. Peut-être qu'ils ont... Alors, une chose qu'on sait par rapport au Covid, c'est le grand régulateur, le grand nivellateur, puisqu'on réalise que les sociétés avancées, finalement, ont été... par ailleurs, un peu plus vulnérables que d'autres sociétés, notamment en ce qui concerne l'Afrique. On a vu ça dans le débat ce matin. Et donc, je passe la parole à Monsieur Lamotte, sachant, Excellence, que vous êtes un grand sportif, vous êtes tennisman de haut niveau, vous avez représenté la Coupe Davis 2 fois de votre pays, et donc justement, pour stimuler cet esprit de débat et de compétition entre les différentes idées qu'on aimerait mettre en valeur pendant ce débat. Je vous laisse la parole.
Je vous remercie, et je tiens à remercier d'ailleurs l'Institut MEDays pour l'organisation de ce forum, de cette visioconférence. C'est du nouveau dans le monde de pouvoir rester à la maison et de la maison étant parler au reste du monde, communiquer avec vous au Maroc, à la France, la Belgique. Donc, c'est vraiment quelque chose d'extraordinaire que nous permet d'avoir la technologie. Aujourd'hui, nous avons accueilli, en tout cas dans les pays du Sud, avec énormément d'espoir, l'annonce de ce vaccin de la société Pfizer qui viendrait renforcer une solution à la crise que nous vivons. Mais bon, il faut attendre un peu plus pour voir ce qui se passe et ce qui va se passer. Donc, je voudrais commencer par dire que dans les pays du Sud, en tout cas dans la Caraïbe, et principalement en Haïti, où j'ai été Premier ministre pendant 2 ans et demi, 31 mois pour être exact, nous avons vécu une situation très spéciale. Pendant que le monde entier souffrait avec des infections par millions tous les jours, nous avons vécu une situation où les infections en Haïti restent des plus basses au monde. Donc ça, c'est un phénomène que aujourd'hui, très peu de gens arrivent à comprendre parce qu'il y a eu très peu de morts, grâce à Dieu. Il y a eu très peu d'infections. Et aujourd'hui, nous pouvons dire que la pandémie n'a pas vraiment frappé Haïti. Bien entendu, une vie de perdu, c'est une vie de trop. Mais il y a eu très peu de morts, il y a eu très peu d'infections globalement en Haïti. Et les infections qui ont été causées principalement par les Haïtiens qui vivent en République dominicaine. Il y a un taux d'infection assez énorme en République dominicaine qui retournait chez eux, donc ce qui a créé le niveau d'infection que nous avons vu. Donc, à notre niveau, on n'a pas vraiment eu une catastrophe sanitaire dans ce sens. Pas comme la catastrophe sanitaire que j'avais dû gérer, qui était le choléra, où nous avions eu 8 000 morts et 800 000 personnes infectées du choléra. Donc, grâce à Dieu, on n'a pas eu aujourd'hui cette situation aussi catastrophique. Ceci dit, on a eu, par contre, une situation économique très difficile. Donc, il y a eu un impact énorme sur Haïti, vit à plus de 30% de son PIB, des transferts d'argent de la diaspora. Donc, la diaspora haïtienne vivant aux États-Unis, vivant en France. Donc, on parle d'environ 3,6 milliards de dollars par an, où il y a une projection que ces recettes qui apportent quand même des devises à l'économie haïtienne, qu'il y aura une baisse d'environ plus de entre 30 à 40% de ces recettes seront révisées à la baisse. Donc, ce qui a créé une situation économique difficile. Il est aussi important d'évaluer l'impact de l'aide d'urgence du Fonds monétaire international, qui a eu quand même une intervention assez importante à faire dans nos pays, en Afrique et dans les Caraïbes, principalement Haïti. Donc ça, je pense qu'il serait important de revoir ça aussi et de voir l'impact de cette aide économique d'urgence du FMI. Donc nous avons aussi pu témoigner d'un tsunami de data. Donc cette crise sanitaire a créé une situation assez différente dans les pays du Nord et dans les pays, en tout cas du Sud et de la Caraïbe, où aujourd'hui, malgré les soucis économiques, mais il y a eu globalement un rapprochement de nos populations et aussi de nos communautés d'affaires. Aujourd'hui, c'est quelque chose qui ne serait pas pensable il y a un an. On reste dans son salon ou chez soi et on fait des rencontres avec des leaders à travers le monde. On fait des leaders politiques et des leaders économiques. Et ça permet une fluidité des affaires et une rapidité dans les contacts et dans les échanges, ce qui aura certainement un impact positif sur nos économies à court, moyen, long terme. Donc nous autres, de notre côté, nous voyons que avec l'annonce de ce vaccin, un vaccin qui, maintenant, il faudrait avoir le prix, il faudrait avoir la distribution, il faudrait avoir l'efficacité. Alors, ils disent que c'est une efficacité à 90%, donc il faudra on souhaite que ce soit le cas. En tout cas, c'est une bonne nouvelle. Et nous avons remarqué ce tsunami de data où les sociétés téléphoniques, très certainement, ont eu à bénéficier de cette crise sanitaire dans tous les secteurs. Ce n'est pas tous les secteurs, en tout cas, qui sont tombés. En tout cas, dans nos pays, les sociétés de téléphonie devront certainement continuer à investir dans leur réseau pour apporter une 4G ou une 5G de qualité pour pouvoir soutenir ce tsunami de data où les gens maintenant, pratiquement les applications, comme par exemple les Netflix et tout, sont monnaie commune. Donc moi, je pense qu'en ce qui a trait au COVID-19, eh bien, la réalité vécue dans les grands pays est totalement différente de la réalité connue dans les pays du Sud. Donc, il y a eu totalement une déconnexion. Et ceci, je ne sais pas si c'est à cause du climat, je ne sais pas si c'est à cause du soleil. Personne n'arrive à l'expliquer encore. Mais je pense que ça, ce serait un point à débattre. La différence de l'impact du COVID dans les pays, par exemple, comme un pays comme la France contre un pays comme Haïti ou comme un pays comme, par exemple, le Sénégal et tout. Donc, il faudra très certainement faire d'autres débats là-dessus pour mieux comprendre. Nous sommes à 1h, nous sommes à 900 km des États-Unis. Donc, Haïti a suivi de manière très, très approche l'élection américaine. Nous avons une énorme communauté haïtienne d'ailleurs qui s'est mobilisée, qui a voté. Et l'impact immédiat de cette élection, moi je pense que le grand vainqueur de tout ça, ce sera très certainement la planète. La planète, comme nous la connaissons aujourd'hui, a d'énormes difficultés, d'énormes défis environnementaux et qui tendaient à être mis de côté par l'administration sortante. Donc la planète aura très certainement, c'est-à-dire on parle de l'accord de Paris, on parle de la politique environnementale du gouvernement américain, on parle, l'élection elle-même a montré aussi beaucoup de failles. Beaucoup de failles dans un sens, parce que personne n'aurait jamais pu penser qu'on serait au milieu d'une crise constitutionnelle pareille dans un pays comme les États-Unis. Cependant, tous les pays africains et les pays du Sud en général pourront très certainement s'attendre à une politique, on le souhaite, imprégnée de plus de respect mutuel et plus de solidarité, je pense. Je pense que pendant les dernières 4 années, il y a eu très certainement un manque de solidarité, un manque de respect mutuel avec les certains commentaires faits par le président sortant. Ça ne pourrait guère améliorer les relations. D'ailleurs, comme a dit le président Kagame, et comme a réagi l'Afrique et les Caraïbes qui étaient traités de pays de... Enfin, vous avez entendu les commentaires, je ne sais pas la peine de les répéter ici. Mais globalement, l'élection américaine, malgré tous les problèmes, je pense qu'ils s'en sortiront et la planète elle-même et les pays du Sud, en tout cas, sortiront les grands vainqueurs de tout ça. Merci.
Absolument, je partage votre optimisme. Notamment, vous avez mentionné, bien entendu, les packages les recovery packages, les packages de relance économique sur les énergies vertes, l'accord de Paris. Alors, on a oublié dans tout ça la Chine, qui a annoncé qu'elle sera neutre en carbone en 2060, chose qu'elle ne voulait jamais s'aventurer jusque-là en termes d'efforts environnementaux. Et alors, par rapport au prix du vaccin, on sait très bien qu'une chose est sûre par rapport à ce vaccin, c'est que les économies d'échelle seront là, puisque le marché est énorme, il n'a jamais été aussi grand dans l'histoire de l'humanité. Et bien entendu, ce qui a aussi été intéressant de voir, c'est comment l'Internet nous a permis finalement de gérer cette crise sans précédent. Alors, sans trop attendre, je vais parler maintenant en anglais et I'll switch to English. Donc, vous pouvez changer la langue, comme je vous disais, sur le Zoom. Alors, il faut savoir qu'entre-temps, les applications, l'industrie des IT, Internet et télécommunications et Zoom est passé de 10 millions à 200 millions d'abonnés. Donc, en l'espace de quelques mois, oui. C'est une des nouveautés qu'on a eues avec ce virus. Your Excellency, Mr. Bill Ramel, you have been a British Labour Party politician for many years. You have been a spokesperson for the Foreign Office, Minister of State in charge of higher education. You have also been at the Defense Department. And basically, you know, I'd like to have your take on what will be actually the leaps that this crisis will enable our societies to achieve, in your view?
Thank you very much, and I'm really pleased to be able to participate. And before I go on to talk about the leaps, I want to first talk about some of the impact of the crisis, because I think in a very real sense, COVID has been the largest societal and global challenge of my lifetime. And it has built on and reinforced trends that were already in play. The last decade has seen the pernicious rise of the authoritarian populist nationalism across the globe, rejecting evidence-based decision-making, urging the drawing up of walls. It's driven a coach and horses through international cooperation and collaboration. Trump, Brexit, Putinism, Bolsonaro, the examples are legion. And at first glance, the terrifying spread of COVID-19 has reinforced nationalism and moved further away from multilateral cooperation. And the focus of almost every government appears to have been based on national responses to COVID-19 rather than seeking global solutions and actions, and that's certainly been a profound consequence of COVID. The economic hit has been enormous, an economic shock, and we need to recall and remember this, 3 times worse than the 2008 financial crisis, which, remember, took us a decade to recover from. The World Bank estimates that the pandemic will push 50 million people into poverty. And moving forward, I think, challengingly, we're likely to see a substitution of capital for labour, with skill and labour-intensive industries contracting because of the vulnerability to viruses of all kind. The health impact, similarly, has been colossal, with 1.2 million deaths worldwide. In parts of the developing world like Africa, a reversal of positive progress on immunisations for diseases such as polio. We've also seen the huge impact on non-COVID ill health driven by the lockdowns. In the UK, a staggering 90% reduction in doctor referrals for cancer. In the US, 40% fewer hospital visits for heart attack symptoms. UNICEF estimates 117 million children across 37 countries may not receive immunisation in time to prevent a measles outbreak. In short, lockdown itself is causing greater ill health and death from non-COVID ill health. And there's also the mental health toll. Isolation, fear and post-traumatic stress, according to the Royal College of Psychiatrists here in the UK, driving a mental health pandemic, with the numbers seeking help because of suicidal thoughts tripling since lockdown. And the most lasting impact may be to the life chances of children and young people because of the way the pandemic has impacted on their education. In the UK, and I think this echoes around the world, the lockdown has reinforced and driven disadvantage. Our Institute for Fiscal Studies has shown that during lockdown, children from better off households spent 30% more time each day on educational activities than children from the poorest fifth of households. And the use of predicted grades for university admission have disadvantaged young people from poorer backgrounds. And that would have been worse if the UK government had continued, as originally intended, the use of a discredited algorithm. And finally, and I think in many senses this is one of the most alarming, there has been the alarming growth in the dissemination of dis and misinformation about the pandemic, often by our elected leaders such as Trump and Bolsonaro, trivializing the risks of COVID, questioning and challenging the use of mitigation measures such as wearing of masks, promoting unproven treatments, and flatly contradicting the public health experts. And that has real impact. The Royal Society of Open Science surveyed 5 nations and found that substantial proportions of these populations viewed misinformation as highly reliable. And all of that, I think, presents a profound risk to public health. So that has been, in many senses, a lot of the impact. But can the day after the crisis genuinely be a day after, as is the debate for this panel? Well, I'm by nature an optimist, and I'm heartened by the history in the United Kingdom. I think this is replicated across the world. Both world wars brought in their aftermath major progressive social change. After the First World War, we saw the first major steps for women's rights. And after the Second World War, we saw the creation in the UK of our National Health Service and the building of our welfare state. So what are the positives after COVID? Well, one of the positives is building on the power of the internet, the online interconnections, communications, meetings that have taken place. Zoom video conferencing has grown 20-fold during the pandemic, and we need to see how that can be applied moving forward. Secondly, I think there will be an economic recovery with growth in the 3rd and 4th quarters this year and on into 2021. McKinsey is reporting the proportions of executives expecting global economic conditions to improve, far outstripping those who expect a deterioration. And we are seeing in advanced economies a boom in house building as people flee to the suburbs and rural areas. But I think growth rates are not likely to be robust, and a lot will depend on a vaccine. And obviously the news in the last day or so from Pfizer is very positive, but the timescales still remain to be seen and the efficacy. And therefore, a genuine and sustained recovery is likely still, I think, to take years. But I think there's also likely to be a positive change in how we recover economically and fiscally. With ballooning deficits and debts, there is no appetite for a return to austerity. The focus rather is likely to be on tax rises for the better off and viewing the economic impact of COVID as a once-in-a-lifetime economic and fiscal shock, needing to be written off by central banks and paid back through growth over decades. And both of those, in my view, are very healthy developments. We're also seeing and are likely to see a green recovery with a resurgence and a surge in renewable energy. Home working, reductions in commuting, and expanded use of green technology will see carbon emissions this year fall by about 8%. The International Energy Authority predicts global demand is on course for its largest annual decline in history. And the same IEA suggests measures in place because of COVID are driving a major shift towards low carbon sources of electricity. So that's a real positive. I think we're also likely to see a better evidence base and understanding of what works in tackling future pandemics. The mass use of test and trace has enabled countries such as South Korea and Taiwan to significantly outperform others in tackling COVID. And I think that evidence base has to be promoted and strongly communicated. We're also seeing much better integrated health working. Here in the UK, within the health and social care sector, the response to COVID in terms of collaboration and innovation has been, I think, remarkable and positive. Hospitals built in weeks, collaborative working between the health service and local authorities, departmental structures shaken up with clinicians working well beyond normal disciplines. The use of effective technology has increased significantly with better digital transfer of medical records and a staggering 97% increase in online prescriptions, with virtual consultations growing exponentially. And crucially, ordinary people have been effectively engaged in taking steps to protect their health and prevent ill health. And similar trends exist across the globe. The challenge is how we sustain and grow them. And in some ways, I think we're likely to see improvements as well in the quality of life through home working and not commuting becoming much more normalized. But there is a downside to that, where the lack of personal interaction potentially reduces productivity and social interaction. And I think that is a particular challenge for young people. And we are seeing, I think, very welcomely, a positive reassertion of the importance of informed research data and evidence to counteract misinformation and drive policy. The UN communications response to combat the spread of mis and disinformation has been very welcome, as is the development by tech platforms such as Twitter and Facebook of policies to call out lies and misinformation. And Donald Trump's emphatic defeat, despite the fraudulent attempts to deny democracy, I think is a sign that people will not sustain and tolerate mendacious misinformation and deceit. And the return of experts and expertise to the heart of governmental decision-making, again, I think is healthy. I will never forget in this country the mendacious claim by Michael Gove, a senior government minister during our Brexit referendum campaign, that the country had, quote, had enough of experts. So the return of experts, expertise and evidence to decision-making is welcome, but it is still a work in progress. I think, heading to a conclusion, we need a better collective understanding of what science can do to aid and inform decision-making, but also its limitations. As Stephen Meek from Nottingham University has powerfully argued, the issue, and I'm quoting, the issue with COVID-19 is not that the science is unusually uncertain, but that it is being developed in the public eye and at speed, with theories tested in real time and with direct effect on people's lives. The danger is that when science is presented as a security blanket to protect against the terrifying uncertainty of a global pandemic, people will feel let down when the reality is different and conclude that science is no more reliable an authority than anything else. Now, my view is rather it is an authority, but it has to be contextualized, its limitations and changes explained. and the critical role of political interpretation and decision-making reasserted. But we are moving in the right direction. So very finally, I think a number of positives flowing from the day after COVID, but the biggest challenge still to be effectively resolved will be a more polarized politics. The already established conflict between populist, nationalist, protectionist right and the more liberal, progressive and global centre and left is likely to be exacerbated, at least in high-income democracies. That battle will determine what a more assertive and enabling state should be doing, and I think will determine how we enduringly recover from COVID over the medium to longer term.
Thank you. That was quite a comprehensive overview of the COVID and post-COVID situation. Interestingly enough, it's like the world has been suffering what I would describe a shock and awe attack, global attack on mankind. And this is, luckily, no infrastructure have been destroyed on the way. So this is, the shock and awe doctrine is actually, we have the author of that doctrine among us, the next speaker, Mr. Uyman Harlan, who has obviously been very active as a strategist, but also started in defense operations. And interestingly enough, as an academic, not only is he the principal author of the shock and awe doctrine, military doctrine, but he's also the author of Anatomy of Failure, Why America Loses Every War It Starts. And according to the critiques that I've read on this book, it always falls back on the human factor, on the leadership factor, which prevents great institutions, great democracies, economies, to be able, or even authoritarian regimes, to be able to tackle a problem that is before and all science-based. So with that, I'd like to pass the floor to Mr. Harlan. Please enlighten us on what we have gone through, what is likely to come, and what is likely going to remain as a sustained legacy of this crisis.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. And I hope next year we'll be able to meet in Morocco, and this will be over. The basis for Anatomy of Failure, and indeed Shock and Awe, was the need for knowledge and understanding of situation. And the reasons we've lost every war we started, namely Vietnam and of course the Second Iraq War, was a failure to understand and to have sufficient knowledge of the situation. That is repeating today. If you go back to inflection points in history over the last century, 1914, the start of World War I, 1939, the start of World War II, 1989, the demise of the Soviet Union or its beginning, and 2001 and the attacks against the World Trade Centers and the Pentagon. This year, 2020, is another inflection point. And I have argued in the new book that I'm writing that Corona and COVID-19 was the initiator of what I call the fifth horseman and a new MAD, replacing the old Cold War MAD of mutual assured destruction with massive attacks of disruption. Society has been hugely and profoundly disrupted by COVID, and this is not the only disruptor we face, of which we are largely ignorant. In addition to great power competitions, I would suggest that two of the greatest disruptors are climate change, which has existential potential, and most importantly, currently, failed and failing government. And I only point to the two greatest democracies of the 20th century, Great Britain and America, to make this point about failed and failing government. Now, history, it seems to me, offers at least some insight. If one goes back to the 1918-1920 pandemic, the Spanish flu in the United States, and looks at it very closely, there are several observations. First, the Spanish flu was not recognized. Most Americans, including President Woodrow Wilson, denied its presence. About 700,000 Americans died of it, which today, according to the current population, would be over 2 million. At the same time, we were engaged in World War I, and the country was besieged and terrorized with letter bombs, fears of anarchists in ways that really trivialize what happened after 2001. The Sedition and Espionage Act was used to suspend habeas corpus and arrest tens of thousands of people. Many thousands were deported. And the country really was being terrorized during this time of the pandemic. And then magically, when it ended, the United States entered the greatest economic boom in its history. Let me say that again, the greatest economic boom in its history. It did so because Warren Harding then president, was able to pass the Transportation Act because the automobiles came on scene with all the demands for resources for supporting hospitality, gasoline, and other infrastructure, and electrification. And so there is a model here to be found. Now, how do we get through COVID-19? The Pfizer vaccine, which apparently has a 90% effective rate of preventing the disease, is extraordinarily important. But there are two factors here that are going to be critical. The first is production, because we're talking about billions of doses. And second is distribution. You're talking about distributing this product at minus 94 degrees Fahrenheit. So while the vaccine shows great promise, logistics is going to be critical. And in the United States, assuming that Joe Biden becomes the president, distribution and production will become his responsibility. And I think the Trump administration will do everything it can to impose roadblocks, including the turnover in government, in which we will not have a director of health and human services probably for some time. Now, I would suggest that a year from now, expect that during the 1918-1920 pandemic, about 50 million people died. If you scale that to the population, that is somewhere between 250 and 500 million people. Not sure we'll reach that scale of death, but just to approximate. Now, assuming we get through, assuming that our government changes peacefully, and I'll have a word to say about that later, and a year from now or so, maybe we'll be through the worst of the COVID, what do we do next? The first thing is that we need to repeat the economic recovery boom that followed the Spanish flu. What the administration, the new administration, must do is to put in place what I call a national investment fund or bank of at least $2 to $3 trillion. That's part public, part private, underwritten by the government with long-term 30-year bonds that pay 2% above prime, that are guaranteed by the government, that go into a major investment program that will cover healthcare, that will cover all sorts of technologies, because we were totally unprepared for this type of disruption, that will cover not only healthcare, but the environment, renewable energies. The new Green Deal is not affordable, but there are things that we can do, and get into the infrastructure repair program, which we desperately need, using 5G and broadband communications globally and throughout the United States as means to spearhead this recovery, as we did in 1918 and 1920 and the post-Spanish flu recovery. Now, I think all this is possibly achievable, but let me get beyond climate change to what is really the most dangerous disruptor we face, and that's failed and failing government. In the United States, I think this election has exposed great flaws in the Constitution. Without getting into specific detail, unless there is really a peaceful and amicable transition, such as Al Gore conceding to George Bush over 537 votes in Florida in the year 2000, the Constitution really is not clear on a transformation of government. We have this antiquated electoral college where 270 votes are required, but through legal action and litigation, Donald Trump could probably prevent 270 votes or a majority in the Electoral College from being achieved on December 14th. Under those circumstances, the selection of the president will go to the House of Representatives, where of the 50 states, each state gets one vote, and the 117th Congress will have 26 delegations controlled by Republicans, even though Democrats will be in the majority. So if the election gets to the House of Representatives, irrespective of Joe Biden winning by over 4 million votes, you could see Donald Trump becoming reelected as president. I don't think this is going to happen, but I just want to make the point that by no means is a easy transfer of power likely given the personality and lack of character of this particular person. So on the one hand, we have an opportunity post-COVID for a huge recovery that I think is possible, and this will have to have opponent. The United States, this investment fund or bank, needs to be able to raise other monies that can be used globally to assist in all this. But we've got to get through the next 70 days of this transition. And once we do that, the Biden administration will also have the difficulty of forming itself. In the past, it normally takes at least 6 to 12 months for an administration to be up and fully running, given the need to have confirmation in the Senate. And bear in mind, the Senate will not be fully decided upon until January 5th, when 2 runoff elections are taking place in Georgia. And it's uncertain as to whether or not Republicans or Democrats are going to be in charge of the Senate, which leads to this uncertainty. So to sum up, I think that we will be able to get through this pandemic because of the nature of the vaccines, assuming that they are as effective as seems to be indicated, and that the production and distribution issues can be handled, which I suspect they can. Once we get through that, if the government is capable of doing this, putting in place a national investment bank or investment fund is the way that we can deal with an economic recovery. What's interesting, in 1918 to 1920, the US stock market actually did pretty well. And if you look at the stock market today, the Dow Jones is close to 30,000, which is indeed quite remarkable, suggesting there's an awful lot of money here and that there are all sorts of engines of potential growth. But to conclude, my greatest concerns are with failed and failing governments, especially in the United States. 70 million people voted for Donald Trump. Donald Trump is not going to go away easily. He will retain that base, and even if it is divided by half or a third, there are going to be tens of millions of Americans who actually will believe that Trump was cheated out of becoming the next president. And that's going to be an enormous task for Vice President, President-elect Joe Biden to deal with. It also raises fundamental problems for the Republican Party. Once known as the Grand Old Party, the GOP has become the TOP, Trump's own party. And the Republicans are going to have to make up their mind whether or not they are prepared to abandon Trump in the expectation of healing America and governing America, or they're going to continue the fight. At this stage, I can only hope that Republicans will come from their senses. But in addition to COVID-19, and over the long term, even though John Maynard Keynes said we're dead, I think there are grounds for optimism. In the short term, I can only hope that we'll be able to get through this failed and failing government and the huge differences that exist in this polarized country, a country that has not been so polarized since the Civil War in 1861. And I can only hope that Joe Biden will govern as an American, not a Republican and a Democrat, and hope further that this will be enough to bind the nation together. But if not, buckle up, because we are in for an excessively rough ride if that does not happen.
Thank you very much. Obviously, luckily, this buckling up will take hopefully only a few months in the best of cases, namely by January 20th. We hope that this would be resolved. This actually, you know, when you talk about the greatest economic expansion the United States has witnessed after World War I, and the current impact that COVID has had on our societies. In fact, there is an interesting parallel because no infrastructure has been destroyed, as I had mentioned earlier, as has been the case of Europe after World War II, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, as soon as you have an economic recovery that is really hefty, you end up falling into the boom and bust cycles. And we all know about the 1929 economic crisis. We know that, you know, it's been recovered through the New Deal. Now we have notions of Green Deals coming up. And it's almost tempting to think whether the combination of Green Deals and economic growth could prevent boom and bust cycles and also prevent, hopefully, the building up of nationalism and what we've seen after the 1929 economic crisis. So I'd like to throw the ball at Mr. Jean-Yves Le Terme to have his take on that combination of economic recovery, large economic boom, and averting crashes, or a path to even worse case scenarios where nationalism take over and conflicts erupt.
Yeah, I think the issue of nationalism and populism has also other reasons than, let's say, the economic situation. There are narratives related to identity, to all kinds of distrust people have in leadership that fuel populism and facilitate also the work for political parties, for leaders. So I'm not sure that coming back on track in terms of economic development will solve the issues we have with representative democracy, with the difficult interaction between citizens and political leadership. I think this is a phenomenon that is also linked to the essence, the core of how democracy works, how representative democracy works. And there's a lot to work to do in terms of finding new interfaces, new kinds of interfaces between politicians and political authorities and citizens. There's also the issue of what we call the liquid feedback, the need for liquid feedback when things are going faster and faster, speeding up in real life, in economic life, in science, and all parts of human activities. Well, then the kind of 19th century set up with elections, with people that are elected in a parliament that give trust to a government that rules and then after some years asks to be or confirmed or sent home. This is the kind of representative democracy that was engineered 200 years ago, and it's not, well, it's clear that it's maybe not up to the level of task it's confronted with now. So I'm not. I think this is still there's still a lot of work to do to restore that kind of confidence. And although it's of course of crucial importance to go to an economic recovery, I'm not sure that that will help to let's say to restore the needed confidence from citizens in the political system, to give it the legitimacy and give the public authorities legitimacy they need to take their decisions and implement their decisions. In terms of the economic recovery, I listened very carefully to what a colleague said. What I haven't heard is how we look at the debt levels we have in, let's say, also in most of the developed economies, we have enormous levels of debt. Most of the economies, it's an issue of mainly the public sector, and we are luckily quite still having sustainable level of debts in the private sector. But still, this is an issue that should be looked at, and where I would be very keen to hear from colleagues how they see this, how these enormous level of debts, how we can address these at a moment where we need massive investment to have the energy transition and to invest in all kinds of infrastructure that's still needed to have the full economic development we need.
So that would be a good way to open the debate. Obviously, World War II has been financed by the US on war bonds, where it's essentially the US citizens that invested in government bonds to support the war effort. And it would be interesting. We know that in the case of the US, there's obviously a lot of cash in the economy, in households. And globally, that could also be the case in other countries. Could we see this type of this type of framework, taking on or supporting government proactive economic growth policies? Anyone would like to respond to that? Go ahead, please, Mr. Ullman.
I've made that argument for a national investment bank about 15 years ago. In fact, I got 2 senators to actually draft legislation. And the way that you would do this, it's a public-private partnership. You would raise $2 to $3 trillion. It would be guaranteed by the government in long-term bonds at, say, 200 basis points or 2% above prime. So it's very attractive. And that it would be paid for by you tolls. And it would be looking at job creation, obviously in the healthcare industry, obviously in the renewable energy industries, and also in massive infrastructure. Certainly in the United States, our infrastructure is sort of mid-20th century. Indeed, in establishing broadband, 5Gs throughout the country, improving roads, highways, airports, et cetera, as we did in the early 1920s, it seems to me that this is a way that you can stimulate growth. And whereas many presidents have said we're going to grow our way out of this debt situation, unfortunately, economic growth was never really put in place at a fast enough growth rate because of the pay off the debt. But I think this is a bet that we can take, and this would really put the United States and much of the rest of the world on a competitive place for the rest of the 21st century. As I said, the answer is a national investment bank financed to about $2 to $3 trillion in long-term bonds that would be looking at putting money into the technologies, into the growth areas, as well as infrastructure that really will put in place this engine for growth. And I repeat, in 1920, electrification and automobiles were the drivers. Now, one of the big difference between then and now in 1929 was we lacked sufficient regulation through the SEC. And quite frankly, if you look at the 2008 crash in the United States, the financial crash, we recovered from that quite quickly because we seem to have in place the necessary checks and balances. So I'm less worried about a financial collapse post-COVID than I am in not putting in place this national infrastructure bank, which obviously has global implications because what happens here clearly can be done elsewhere. To some degree, the Chinese have tried to do this with Belt and Road Initiative, in which they want to gain access to markets and resources. But the fundamental problem for the Chinese is that there's no way to collateralize the loans and money they're putting up. For example, they've taken over the port in Sri Lanka, but there's no cash flow. And the big difference between this idea for an infrastructure fund, an investment fund, and what the Chinese doing is that there is good cash flow that's generating through fees and tolls that will be able to pay off the bonds over the long term.
But let's also not forget that when China has a political will to look far beyond economic cycles to build, on renewables in the long term, etc., they're basically they've been the engine of all the new renewable energy revolutions, essentially dropping down the cost of wind and solar and other technologies. So the government is capable of taking bold actions against economic odds. The issue of infrastructure in the US, to take that topic, has been mentioned by presidential candidates, Trump, Obama, and effectively on the ground, it's much easier to fund the Pentagon and to try to wage wars elsewhere than to fund domestic infrastructure. So I'm wondering why this time around it would work.
It may not, but we have no alternative. And Biden has already said he's going to have an infrastructure plan. Desperation certainly sometimes is the mother of invention. And look, we have huge divides in this country between rich and poor. That's what the election spelled out. The fact that Trump got 70 million votes, many of those votes from minorities, from African Americans, from Hispanics, from working people. And so the only way that we're going to be able to have some kind of a degree of fairness is to build the entire economy. And will Biden be successful? Who knows? The Republicans in Congress could oppose him. And of course, he's got to look forward to 2022 when the by-elections take place. But I think he's got to build on crisis to do this. We were able to do it after the 2008 financial meltdown. And we certainly did it in 1920 with good old Warren G. Harding, who sadly died after only 2 years in office. So I hope that Joe Biden will be a longer living Warren Harding, and there's no reason why we can't repeat, but failed and failing government is the major obstacle we face, and you've got to get over that. And your point is absolutely correct. We could fail at that, and if we do, future generations are going to regret that for their duration.
We also have a different setting this time around, namely we are also in an energy transition. What I'm referring to right now is basically it was mentioned earlier by Bill Ramel. Basically the energy demand has dropped 7 times higher than in the 2008 crisis. And so that is huge compared to what has happened in recent history. And obviously, we have now, for example, new technologies that are becoming more and more compelling. Renewables have shown during the crisis that they have expanded thanks to when the demand dropped. Obviously, renewables kept producing, and so the share of renewables in networks and grids increased tremendously during the crisis. And it has shown the resilience of the infrastructure with a high rate of renewables. Now we know that we also have renewable energy storage technologies. We have hydrogen, for example, which can also has the potential to abate double-digit CO2 emissions globally if you just take out the steel and fertilizer industries, which Morocco is a major player of. So you have these technologies. You get some major oil-producing countries like Saudi Arabia that invest $5 billion into the world's largest hydrogen green ammonia project for supplying global markets. Now that has been actually sidestepped by Australia's $36 billion major project status for a green ammonia export project, which also will involve the transformation of its iron ore business into clean production potentially. So where I'm getting at is that it looks like the traditional fossil oil business may be shifting, that rent-based economy may be shifting into a more industrial model, more inclusive model. How would that translate, in your view, in the economic recovery packages and in that previous rent-based scheme that keeps on setting the boom and bust cycles? I'm trying to revert again on the sustainable path that mankind can take after the crisis. Who would like to take on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think the green revolution and the growth of renewables has got an important contribution to make, and I think it can be significant. But I want to come back, if I can, to the debate around debt and what we do about it. What I would plea for is that we take time. If we look back at the 2008 crisis, certainly in the UK and other countries did this as well, there was a headlong rush to reduce debt with very significant social and economic consequences. So, you know, I'm attracted to the arguments that you know, ultimately you have to pay off the debt, but it's how you do it, over what timescale. I'm attracted to the arguments that have been put forward around a national investment bank. I ultimately think that supply side measures and investment are critical to re-engineering growth, which is the only sustainable long-term way you can tackle the debt problem. But I also think that taxation has to play a significant role. If we look at personal and corporate and business tax rates today compared to where they were decades ago, when we faced similar fiscal and economic crises, they are significantly lower, and particularly for people on higher incomes, I think that has to be part of the solution. But I also think, coming back to that argument about, you know, how Donald Trump secured 70 million votes in the United States, and I bow to nobody in my loathing for what he stands for and how he works. But I do think across the board, we need to understand the causes, the underlying causes of what has led to the growth in nationalist populism, not just in the United States, but across the world. Globalization, that people feel that they've got no stake in, significant economic change, which is leaving people behind. And even though I'm an advocate of immigration, immigration in a way that people feel they have no control and purchase over it. The way we respond economically has to be able to give people a sense of control about what is happening around them. And if we do that, I think we'll be in a much stronger position to rebut the nationalist populists like Trump.
Actually, you've raised an interesting issue with immigration, and we've seen that trend before the COVID crisis, when actually a country like China started to invest in emerging economies for supplying regional markets. So where I'm getting at is that the COVID-19 crisis has obviously shown that the globalization based upon China supplying everybody may be a little bit outdated, and we may now grow into a model where actually supply chain will be more regionally distributed. And if you do so, not only does it make security sense, it could also make economic sense and generate prosperity in developing countries in various regions in the world more inclusively. I don't know whether Laurent Lamotte, would you like? I mean, you've obviously been very active in talking about how emerging economies could have had a chance now in today's global context, economic context.
Well, regarding the immigration, my view is, this is an issue that has to be dealt with not only by the receiving countries, but also by the countries where the immigration is originating from. Because one of the biggest issues with immigration in general is that the people living, and we know tons about that because Haiti happens to be one of the biggest countries of immigration. But at the end, when you talk to them, to the people leaving, they're 99% of them go to a place where they're going for an opportunity, where they know they can get a job, where they know that they will get some revenues to feed their family back home. So the paradigm has to be probably shifted into enhancing the legal mechanism of obtaining a job while being at home and entering to the market, rather than attempting your life going through very harsh conditions. I was actually in a very interesting position, which was a few weeks ago. I received a call, an anonymous call, because the guy got my number on Instagram, and he called me and he was explaining to me a journey that he's doing, that he left Haiti 8 months ago. He had sold everything that he had. He had $2,000 when he left, and 8 months after, he had $250 left, and he was going from Haiti through Chile, Brazil, Honduras, Colombia, Guatemala, Costa Rica, going through Mexico to head to the United States. And I was trying to understand, the reasons why, he was, risking his life. He was with his child, and basically, it was, to get a job, because he feels that's where he can get a job, and that's where, they need his skills, and the skills are very basic. And this is, so I think that there needs to be a debate about this immigration issue, because, for example, if there is no jobs in the US, for them, they will not go to the US. I mean, there is a bunch of Haitians going to Brazil or to Chile at the time, because there was opportunities there. So I think that there needs to be better dialogue between, basically the receiving countries and the sending countries to really democratize access. And if there is job postings, to make it, use technology, for example, for that to happen. And that would drive the elimination or the substantial reduction of illegal flows and therefore more manageable flows, rather than having a situation that's uncontrollable and illegal immigration. I think that's what everybody wants to avoid. And in order to do so, investing in the country itself is a smart policy. Especially, what you see that China is doing, in Africa, and you see also South Korea is doing it in the Caribbean, where they're benefiting from the Hope Help Law, that basically all products, textile products assembled in the country is re-exported to the United States duty-free. And that's creating about, over 50,000 jobs. Out of our population of 12 million, that's very little, but still, it's still significant. So I think that, but there needs to be an honest debate regarding this. I think the usual demonization of immigrants, needs to stop, because a lot of countries, where there is immigrants, the immigrants are working and they're doing jobs that for example, the citizens of the country would want to aspire to do, higher paying jobs or higher skilled jobs. So the economic opportunity opens up for the immigrants to find work, and that's why they go there. And there is a need for that. So it's actually demand driven type of immigration. But until we have an honest dialogue, until we have, from the countries receiving to the countries sending, where there can be genuine partnerships. Not only, I'm not talking about partnerships in giving handouts or giving, some rice bags and things like that. I'm talking about genuine partnership, and partnership where the countries are putting infrastructure in place, and in order to keep people in their country getting a decent job, not not like a job of making pennies, but a decent job and keeping the job in country. And at the end, maybe that will be a shift of paradigm, a shift that will show to people, look, you can come to my country, you will come legally, and these are the ways and means. And what it's gonna do is gonna reduce all the coyote routes, all the illegal routes, because you will be surprised of how much the people that have nothing, how much they pay to get to a country where they, in their mind, it's their dream for a better life. So everybody wants to get better, and everybody wants to have a better life for themselves and for their children. And I think at the leadership level and at the at the intellectual elite level, at the think tanks, there should be more genuine discussions and genuine dialogues regarding immigration in general, and to have a more comprehensive approach to it.
And the global supply chain, which is also shifting thanks to COVID, will also contribute to that. Obviously, if production centers are distributed through the global south, this will also contribute to limit also illegal immigration. One other aspect that we tend to underestimate during the crisis is also the social net that some countries have put for vulnerable populations. For instance, in Morocco, I would have never thought that the government would have been able to set up a mechanism providing income for a tremendous amount of people who lost everything and that did not have any social coverage. So that is also an interesting way to increase the active population in the formal sector from the informal sector. And if combined with growth strategies integrated in global delocalized supply chains, could be a game changer. I don't know whether Mr. Yves Le Terme, do you have anything to add on this topic? Because we'd like to open it also on questions on Facebook as well. We have a row of questions. Please go ahead.
Yeah, just two small remarks. I will limit it to 2 or 3 minutes. Number one, about the 5G. We just mentioned it in earlier interventions. I think it's one of the key potential engines for growth and for productivity gains we need to make progress with the economy. But of course, 5G is currently kind of it's the object of a kind of a war between the US, a bit held by European Union, with some solidarity from the European Union, and China. And so I think one thing we should solve, and let's hope that that there can be solutions found is to have one single market for 5G products and not two kinds of technologies, because I think that would damage the potential of this new technology, or this improvement of an existing, a critical improvement of an existing technology. The second, and that's a bit, I was inspired by the words of colleague Lamotte, where I fundamentally can agree that we have to step by step try to come to let's say a more sustainable approach to migration issues. However, I think in terms of the reasons for migration, there's really a lot of work to do still in strengthening free trade. I think it was in 2019 that in Africa, finally, the free trade agreement was signed by, I don't know, 20, or ratification has been done by 20 or 30 countries. But having this common African market will bring much more than to economic development and to give people a decent future in their own country than all kinds of very well designed and fair development aid efforts we've done and investment that has been done. I think this realizing a single market in Africa, having more exchanges between African economies, making it possible to only needed to be able to travel from the one place to the other, persons and goods within the African continent, I think is also critical to solve issues of migration, for instance, when we look at them seen from the European point of view.
Yes, but we've seen throughout Africa, we have obviously all decolonization issues that countries are antagonized. I mean, we see, for example, for Morocco, we got the border to Mauritania that is currently shut for some reason. Trade with Algeria is not very good. I mean, probably you have similar situation occurring in other places in Africa. So it is a challenge indeed to make sure that we can have regional integration. If we cannot have regional integrations, are there any other paths that can be pursued to try to overcome in the short term these obstacles? And that is basically the issues that are at stake.
But you managed to conclude a free trade agreement, I think. I'm not sure. I don't think that Morocco is part of it or has ratified it, but that's really a key issue. I mean, this is a key to further development and to keep added value within the continent, and to have exchanges, to create a market where added values are exchanged. This is really a kind of precondition to have a real economic development and progress the country needs because of its demographic and because just of fairness.
Absolutely, and that's why it is extremely important that regional integration and regional trade should not be hampered in any possible way in the continent. So I'm glad you agree on that. As far as the questions that we have on Facebook, okay, I'm going to have these questions shown up. If I can have perhaps a take on with Erlen Harlan on the US governance structure, China governance structure, and what is likely going to play out in the next years, trying to overcome the COVID recovery. What would you see actually coming up with, for example, the Biden administration, if Joe Biden becomes president? I mean, he's president, mostly elected.
The overarching problem, I think, and this is not trying to oversimplify the issue, is the failure of governments to govern. 1964, 90% of the American people trusted the US government to do the right thing. I'm sure in Great Britain and the United States, that figure is now reversed. Nobody trusts the government. Now, it took a long time for that to happen, but we need competence. And unfortunately, the past number of governments have not been very competent. Now, whether Biden is going to be able to overcome that is really critical. I argue that we need to have knowledge and understanding. We view China as an enemy. That is insane. Our national defense strategy says that we need to compete, we need to deter, and if war comes, we need to defeat China. So the United States has got to change its entire view about how it regards China. To some degree, it's going to be adversarial. Obviously, China is stealing IP, it's intimidating people, it has different rules for investment there and investment elsewhere. But there are areas where we can compete, and there are areas where we can cooperate. Certainly in free and fair trade, certainly in environment, certainly in terrorism, certainly in a world of other things, not to let this competition get out of hand. What we also fail to understand is that China suffers from many, many huge weaknesses. It has an underclass of perhaps 500 million who live under the poverty line. That means President Xi has got to grow the economy at a great rate. It has a shadow economy and huge debt, far greater than is recognized, including in the real estate markets. And so Xi has got all sorts of domestic problems. There are over 100,000 major riots in China a year, and many Chinese are not happy that trillions of renminbi are being sent on Belt and Road. So we have to realize that China is not a monolith. And I think what needs to be done is that if Biden is elected, he needs to sit down, not for a day or two, but probably for a week with President Xi and work out rules of engagement. There are areas where we must cooperate, but we have to put some trust and confidence, because right now, China sees us as somebody who regards them as a danger and a threat, and that cannot be wholesome or healthy. The other 2 points I would make is we need a really competent government. Not to be too harsh, but the Trump administration has been anything but incompetent, anything but competent. And so the best thing that Biden can do is to appoint a cabinet of experienced, capable people and see if he can come to some kind of modus operandi with Congress so that we can really provide a government that looks after the people and not what it's doing right now. Second, as Maynard Keynes says, technology is the issue. You've discussed any number of these technologies. We are in an explosive time where more information is being created in a day than it existed throughout all of history. And so with this National Investment Bank, we need to have incubators for these technologies, sequestration, for example, for coal and energy, new technologies that are really vital in healthcare in terms of how we improve the environment and how we create jobs. There's a revolution to be had, but we have to be clever and competent enough to do that, realizing it's going to take time. We're not going to turn things around overnight, but we've got to get started. And right now, unfortunately, we're in the wrong direction in my view.
So you believe that an empowered Joe Biden as president and an emboldened Xi Jinping, because of its COVID crisis handling, could sit together and work out the rules of engagement?
We have no choice. If we do not do that, I will guarantee you 2 things. One, the standard of living will decline dramatically, and future generations of Americans will not live better than their parents and grandparents. That is inevitable as night follows day. And we have to appreciate that. I think Biden understands. He's 78. I'm older than Joe Biden is, so I'm not sure that that's a handicap. But we really need the vitality and competence, and Biden has the potential. And as I said, we have no option except to go down this new road.
Okay, because we obviously have a US-China session next week that will be dedicated to the change of paradigm in the way this relationship is going to evolve in the future. What I'd like to discuss right now is particularly with Laurent Lamotte, if he's still with us. You are a great friend of Morocco, and we're obviously very thankful for the friendship that you have shown to our country, particularly with respect to our sovereignty. And how would you see the role, in fact, this is a question I'm asked, how do you see the role of Morocco in Africa and globally in South-South cooperation in the future, well, particularly post-COVID?
As you said, I'm a big friend a great friend of Morocco, of the Moroccan people. I love Morocco. I've been there many times. Actually, when I'm outside of Morocco, everybody thinks I'm Moroccan, so I cannot get away from it. So I have a lot of respect and love and admiration for the struggle of the Moroccan people and the plight of what Morocco has gone through, and what Morocco also shows as leadership model, for the southern world. And not only in terms of technology, in banking, in telecommunications, but also in terms of solidarity. I think Morocco is a great leader in solidarity and mutual understanding, and how to work together with other countries and to show genuine partnerships. And I think that's what Morocco develops, is more genuine partnerships, is understanding that, look, we are in a world where you have a lot of inequalities. You're in a world that's, you have a lot of rise of nationalism everywhere that demonizes others, especially the weakest and the most vulnerable. And I think that Morocco has flown above that to show a level of commitment to partnership that's, that's truly second to none. So in terms of leadership and the role that Morocco has, with entering the African Union, that basically, put Morocco in par to really expand the type of collaboration and the type of solidarity throughout Africa, and also entering the other spaces in Africa will definitely help foster that understanding and that love and that togetherness that the country is seeking. So does Morocco have a role in Africa? Absolutely. Beyond Africa, I think Morocco also has a huge role in the Caribbean. And the Caribbean, most of the Caribbean countries, they support Morocco, in your territorial sovereignty all the way. And there was before a lot of misunderstandings, because a lot of people, they were really not understanding what was going on. But now, because of the work of I would say clarity that's brought throughout the world, people understand now and understand the importance and the impact of Morocco's territorial sovereignty.
Thank you very much. There is obviously encouraging news, and we hope we can build upon them. I've got another question. We have now about 20-25 minutes of open questions for the audience. And this is the particular question for Mr. Ullman. And regarding the Middle East peace process, if Joe Biden is confirmed as President of the United States, do you think that the US role in the Middle East will be more balanced? If we take the particular issue of the Palestinian state, do you believe specifically, for instance, whether the US embassy will be displaced? Question is for you, Mr. Ullman.
I don't know about returning the embassy, which I think would be a good idea in the first place. If Biden becomes the transformation would be very, very important, because I think overnight you will have an American president who wants to become engaged in international ways, not just on a transactional basis. And so that by itself, it seems to me, will be really quite important. I think of Biden's priorities, obviously Russia and China and reestablishing American leadership in NATO are really critical. About the Middle East, actually, I hope he can build on some of what Trump did in terms of the Abraham Accords, because the issue here is, how do we move Saudi Arabia closer to Israel? And at the same time, how do we no longer isolate Iran? While this is not a direct answer to a more fair and balanced approach towards the Palestinians, my expectation is that Biden will try to re-enter the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran, based obviously on some steps that Iran must take. Because one of the most dangerous things that the Trump administration did was to withdraw from that. If that agreement was to be honored, and Iran did not cheat on it, Iran would never develop a nuclear weapon. And so I think the situation in the Gulf is still very, very difficult. It's not clear yet who will be Biden's chief advisors if they come out of the Obama administration. I'm not sure that's going to be a step forward. But I think there are great opportunities here to work with Saudi Arabia and indeed Iran to lower the temperature, to provide for the security of Israel. And of course, one of the ways to do that is through trade and investment. At this stage, it's not clear, as I said, who is going to advise Biden. But if you go back and read his foreign affairs articles in January and again in March, it seems to me he's going to take a more traditional approach to try to bring some degree of peace throughout the region, working with Saudi Arabia. And I think the fact that he becomes president will have immediate amelioration as the return of American leadership, it seems to me, will be clear. And I think that will be a very positive step.
Okay, it's interesting because actually the issue of Iran hasn't shown up in Biden's electoral speeches, because obviously must have been a very hot topic. But it doesn't mean that he won't have any latitude to handle
Foreign
the
policy
US
is not an
position.
issue right now. The issue is putting in place a competent government to deal with COVID, to try to heal the nation, and then to put in place some kind of an economic plan to rebuild the economy. Those are his three big steps. And at the same time, he's going to have to deal first, as I said, with China and with Russia. He's also indicated that he wants to have a conference of democracies, probably in the early spring, which I think is very important. And all these issues can be under. Right now, his main task has got to be domestically, even though he's got to appoint a strong Secretary of State and a good national security team to deal with these other issues, which are not going to go away.
So I have a question now, which I'd like to address first, and then I'd like to have Yves Le Terme follow up on it. And it's basically US-European relations post-COVID and in the Biden era. Obviously, the Europeans were among the first to congratulate Joe Biden on his victory, at least electoral college victory.
Not yet. Not
yeah,
yet.
well, yeah, not yet. I mean, the victory with the score on the electoral college, which has not yet been obviously validated, while we are expecting also results from other states, which may confirm or infirm that result. Most likely confirm, but we keep our fingers crossed. You can see a biased position of mine, unfortunately. Obviously, Europeans have congratulated Joe Biden, thinking that this could favor actually US-European relations. Obviously, Biden has been very vocal over this issue during his campaign. What do you think will happen in reality? Do you think that the US-European relation can resume as it has been before during the Biden era, if there is a Biden era? Is Europe still a priority for the United States?
Well, let's
Mr.
hope.
Ullman,
I mean,
okay.
we of course in Europe are conscious of the fact that the center of gravity of the world economy and the development in the world is maybe not in Europe anymore. And so already under Obama, you had a kind of, shift towards other parts of the world. The attention was more eastwards. What we hope in Europe is that at least the fact that we share so many values and that we owe the US a lot also in terms of protecting our security, but that the fact that we share values, that we have the same vision on how human rights, how governance is best organized, that this can be again at the center of a real good cooperation. And of course, at the European side, we also have to do our homework. I think President Trump was not completely wrong in telling us that we should stand up to our obligations in terms of financing NATO, for instance, and the defense efforts we have to do. But most importantly, what we expect and what we hope is that with Joe Biden in the presidency, Joe Biden is, by the way, someone we Europeans know very well. When he was a vice president, he visited frequently the European Union, the capitals. I met him a couple of times then. And you could feel in the conversations we had then that he had a keen interest and a sincere interest in strengthening the alliance between European nations and the United States. So we hope that we can go back to that kind of very close cooperation just based on the fact that we share visions and values. even more important maybe for the whole of the world is that we hope that Joe Biden will be a partner for us, an ally, in re-strengthening the multilateral system. I think we should not underestimate, also in this debate, it hasn't been touched upon yet, but that the fact that after the Second World War, globally speaking, in different specific domains, real candid multilateral organizations were set up, and these organizations were quite successful in addressing a lot of issues in different domains. Of course, they also showed weaknesses, and they're all failures, but multilateralism has really brought a lot of progress. And so we hope that under the Joe Biden administration, that the US will take again its leadership role, its natural leadership role it has in strengthening and in continue to build a strong multilateral governance. Most of the challenges we face have no borders, so solutions should have no borders. And this is more than a slogan. I think it's work day by day to find compromises, to find solutions to deadlocks, be it in the WTO, be it in governance issues of the World Health Organization, and so on. But that is, I think, a second expectation we have in Europe toward, and a hope towards the Joe Biden administration.
Thank you very much. Obviously, Joe Biden has hinted to that possibility, not only based on value in his debate with Donald Trump, in his last debate. He obviously criticized the way Donald Trump handled European leaders in this partnership. But he also said something very, very important. He said the United States is only 25% of the world economy. And with that, you cannot have any leverage on global governance.
Yeah, but
we obviously have a debate on governance tomorrow, on multilateralism on Thursday. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on that, on this 25%, that on the other hand, I think that at least in terms of the narrative, China has been very clear, and Chinese leadership has been very clear that it wanted to become more active and invest a lot in multilateralism. By the way, also already invests really financially, also in terms of human resources. So I think that this could be the task to strengthen again the multilateral governance. This could well be a domain where US and Chinese leadership could meet.
Absolutely, and we've seen also, now that we have the early vaccines that come out, we obviously know that China's got significant striking power in terms of distributing vaccine and producing vaccine globally. And it would be interesting to see how much of that will be bilaterally managed and how much of that will go through multilateralism, namely the WHO. So we do have, as I had mentioned on Thursday, an issue on a debate on this issue. WHO, who cares, is the title of the panel. I've got another question. Thanks a lot for this wonderful panel. My question is, in your opinion, what is the reason that the African continent has fewer deaths from coronavirus, less than 50,000 deaths, compared to a population of 1.5 billion? Who would like to take this question? I think Laurent, Laurent Lamotte, you have mentioned earlier, you have evoked this issue on the situation in Africa, which could be also compared with what's happening in Haiti. Would you like to reply to this question?
Yeah. So the answer here is, I think there needs to be research and analysis done as to the reasons why. I mean, there is different school of thought. Some people say that's because the counting is done the same way. Some other people say because of the warm climate. Some other people say because the population are very much inclined to use malaria-related medicine. So basically, their immune system is built stronger to resist the COVID. And if you see some of the medicines that are used to treat it is very related to malaria-based medicine, anyways, in our countries, and also using a lot of plant-based type of medicine, like we've seen in exactly, and also in Haiti. I mean, everybody's drinking a tea And also there is a cultural approach to this as well. I have to tell you that, for example, in my country, a lot of people, many people got what they called a small flu, okay, but they don't call it, coronavirus. So that affects also certainly the count, and it affects also the capacity of the country to test. So there is a lot of different factors and elements here that will impact. But one thing is for sure, there has not been the massive, and thank God for that, there hasn't been the massive amounts of hospitalization and deaths relating to COVID. And so I think it's an interesting question that I don't think I have the answer to, and many people don't. But it certainly should be looked into as to the reasons why all of a sudden there's been such a massive difference between Europe and Africa, and between the United States and the Caribbean, for example. And I would be very interested in knowing that answer. But basically evidence-based answer, and not people's opinions. And I'm not sure there is evidence-based answers right now, unless I'm wrong. But I'm open to listening.
So we compare US to Europe and both of them to Africa and the Caribbean. Can we take a comparison within Caribbean countries? Is there any country that has a completely different trend in the
So the Dominican Republic has had a lot of cases. But when you go into the reasons why, and they still have cases, and then they still have huge lockdowns and what have you. But when you go into the reasons, is they have a huge basically they have a huge population of Italian tourists. So at one point, the virus was very prevalent in Italy, and then they have other European tourists, so and American tourists as well. So the cocktail of everything created an explosion in the country, which in this case, Haiti doesn't have a lot of tourism. We have very few tourists coming from Europe, and the tourists that come from the US, they are mostly native tourists. So we're talking about the Haitians living abroad. So we haven't had this, this massive impact. But in other Caribbean countries such as Jamaica, Barbados, the Bahamas, it hasn't been really an issue, that you would expect. So the numbers have been really relatively low in Turks and Caicos and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Antigua. We've seen very much controlled. Of course, those are very small countries and small economies. But the biggest impact has not been the actual sanitary impact; it's been the economic impact. Because I was talking to the Prime Minister of Antigua, and the economy is being ravaged by the inability to receive tourism, which about 90% of the revenues come from tourism industry. So you see, this is so where they haven't felt the sanitary impact, they've felt a huge economic blow. So yeah, that's the evidence so far.
Thank you. Actually, last but not least, and to conclude with a spicy note, I have a question to Mr. Ramel. Basically, very, very short one. A Brexit after COVID or not Brexit? What will happen in your view?
I should lay my cards on the table that I'm an implacable opponent of Brexit. But it is, in terms of it happening, I don't think it is now reversible politically within the United Kingdom, certainly not over the short term. But I think the outcome of the American election can have a really beneficial impact in forcing Boris Johnson and his government to compromise and to forge an effective trade agreement with the rest of the European Union. We still have enormous amounts in common interdependencies, socially, economically, with the European Union. And the prospect of a no-deal Brexit would be cataclysmic, certainly for the UK, but for the EU as well. And I think the Johnson government has been doing a lot of bluffing in the move towards the deadline, the fact that we're now very, very strongly looking like having a Joe Biden administration, and particularly one that's going to be very strong about the impact on the Good Friday Agreement in terms of the fallout from Brexit, I think will put the pressure on the UK government to compromise and reach a beneficial agreement, so that we can move forward and still cooperate in those areas that are critically important.
So no major deadlock, essentially, with the Northern Ireland and the border issue with the UK and the rest of the EU. In your view, will I mean, we obviously got a significant political hot potato, must I say?
Well, no, absolutely. I mean, there was within the original the framework agreement that was signed last year, it did effectively establish a border in the Irish Sea, and that's the conundrum that is being grappled with. I think in reaching a trade agreement with the rest of the European Union, we have to resolve that, and I think there are means of doing so. But I think the impact of Biden's victory, and also that, you know, we're already facing one huge economic crisis in terms of the fallout from COVID, to not compromise and reach agreement and actually then see a no-deal Brexit would double down on that economic impact. And I think that combination of forces are going to bring rationality back to the decision-making process, so that we will see compromise and we will see a trade agreement with the European Union being agreed. But that is going to take movement on the part of the UK government over the next few weeks.
Okay, I've got
last intervention, a short one.
Yes, go ahead, please.
It is clear that our mutual objectives are peace, prosperity, and partnership. And what Joe Biden will bring is this commitment to partnership. A closer relationship between the United States and Europe, the EU and NATO, has to be the building block, which expands to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And the only way that we can accomplish those goals is through partnership. So my plea is that not only my colleagues at this roundtable, but people who are attending your convention, your conference, partnership is the key. And the more that we can work together, and that includes Russia and China, the more that we can deal with these disruptors, with these massive attacks of disruption that are global, not local. That to me is the big inflection point and the transition point we have to understand. And it's going to be partnerships that will allow the globe to prosper or the globe not to. That to me is the central piece here.
Okay, I've got a concluding question on the state of Europe. So basically, during the first months of the pandemic, we witnessed a form of separation between EU member countries. For example, we can cite the Italian crisis and critics made about the role of the EU versus Italy and other countries within the EU. Added to that, the Brexit crisis. So do you think that the COVID-19 will end up strengthening the EU or will it end up increasing its internal conflict? Mr. Leterme.
Thank you very much.
You know, you're the only representative from the EU here.
Yeah, I think there's nothing positive at COVID-19. So to say that thanks to COVID, we would have more European integration, I think is a wrong take. I think that the most important decision that was taken during the last year has been the package that has been decided amongst the 27 EU member states for economic recovery. It's quite a very impressive program, the so-called New Green Deal. So I think crucial importance is that this now can be implemented in a good way. We can address the COVID-related economic downturn, but at the same time, fasten up the transition to a more sustainable economic model. So to a certain extent, yes, COVID will have made maybe possible in a more fluid, although with Europe it's always difficult, a more fluent, easy way, the decision-making last summer to come to this economic investment package, stimulus package. But on the other hand, I think that COVID-19 has also showed the weaknesses, by the way, that we share to a certain extent with the US, of a lack of sovereignty in vaccines, in medical stuff, in tools, even in terms of masks and so on. We've seen that Europe has maybe exported too much of its core goods it needs, the production of it to other economies. So that's the downside of the massive liberalizing movement we've seen over the last decades. To sum up, in terms of the answer to the question, I think there's nothing positive at COVID-19. It is a catalyzer has been a catalyzer for EU action through this package that has been decided, this massive investment in the economy and a transition to a more sustainable economy in the summer. But COVID-19 shows also that in terms of sovereignty for vaccines, for masks and so on, well, we might not be the only continent or the only part of the world that's struggling with that, but that certainly the lack of sovereignty is something we have to look after. We have to try to solve in the next couple of years and decades.
But this can obviously be solved with the recovery packages, so it's not a structural problem. One thing that is interesting to note is that the notion of frugal states, North versus South of Europe, have actually completely disappeared during after the crisis. It seems, at least with the recovery packages, we've seen a unity within the European Union.
In the deal making, this kind of difference in approach was still present. And to be fair and open, I think that what happened the last 48 hours with the questioning by the question marks that Orban put to the approval of some parts of the package, well, there's still, we have to see how this turns out. But this kinds of tension between a continent of 27, well, a union of 27 member states, well, that's part of life, and we should try to, of course, to address these issues. And by the way, we always manage to solve, to find solutions, sometimes after nights and nights of meetings and discussions, but we manage, we solve, and also with Brexit, UK conservative leadership has not managed to divide us. We are still very united, stand together, and well, I hope there's a better outcome for Brexit than what we experienced over the last couple of years. But I think that it's a more, let's say, a bigger problem for the UK than for the European Union.
Can I just add 30 seconds to that? I say to our friends and partners in the EU, and I said it in respect to the national populism exemplified by Trump in the United States, the underlying causes need to be tackled. And that is the same case across the European Union. The forces of nationalist populism that drove Brexit in the UK, in my experience, exist in every other EU member state. The only difference is that none of you were stupid enough to have a referendum on membership of the European Union in the way that we were foolish enough to do so in the UK. Those underlying challenges around economic change, dislocation, the handling of immigration have got to be effectively tackled.
I completely agree. Yeah, you're right. And by the way, in terms of referendums, we had the luxury of learning our lessons some 15 years ago on the Maastricht Treaty.
Yeah.
Definitely. I think on that positive note, while we still obviously have some work to do, I'd like to thank very much all of our panelists for their tackling complex and very interesting issues to be dealt with in the future. And we've actually exceeded half an hour, the time that was imparted to us, but I was told by the organizers that they would make an exception, that we made good use of it. I thank you very much, for all of you. Thank you once more for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you.